My name's Dolan Cummings. I'm an Associate Fellow of the Institute of Ideas, and I'll be chairing this keynote session. Do as I say, not as I do. What's wrong with hypocrisy? We're all used to hearing public figures condemned for their hypocrisy, for behaving differently in their private lives, whether it's to do with sexual morality, where they send their children to school, or their recycling practices, contrasting with their public statements about the same issues. But I suppose the question is, when we call someone a hypocrite, are we saying that what they've said is right, but they're falling short in practice? Or are we saying that what they've said is fundamentally mistaken and that what they're doing is actually perfectly all right? So I'll introduce the speakers, who I'm sure will have plenty of examples and people that they want to bring to the discussion, and then later on we can hear from you as well. Let me introduce them in the order they're going to speak. First, on my left, will be Ruth Dudley Edwards, who's a historian, prize-winning biographer and crime novelist, as well as a columnist with the Irish Sunday Independent and a blogger with the Daily Telegraph. And her latest novel, I think, Killing the Emperors, a satire on the contemporary art world. Second, on Ruth's left, will be Professor Joe Frighieri at the Philosophy and Department, University of Malta. He's also a poet and playwright and theatre director, and 3 times winner of the National Literary Prize. Thirdly, on the far right is Dr. Michael Fitzpatrick, a GP and author of The Tyranny of Health, Doctors and the Regulation of Lifestyle, and Defeating Autism, A Damaging Delusion. And then finally, on my immediate right is Anne Atkins, who's a novelist, columnist, and broadcaster, and prize-winning journalist, as well as a regular contributor to BBC Radio 4's Thought for the Day, as many of you probably know. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each speaker to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll use the card system to give a rough indication. At 1 minute to go, I'll give a yellow card. So, Ruth, whenever you're ready.
I once was doing one of those things that one does for free to fill up spaces in newspapers, if you're trying to flog a book. So I was asked to comment on what vices I most hated and what virtues I most liked and the rest of it. And I was with a friend of mine, and I said, so I'm going to write down hypocrisy as my most hated vice. And he said, you think hypocrisy is worse than cruelty? Mm-hmm. And I thought, no, that is completely idiotic. Of course it's completely idiotic. I was idiotic. And of course I'm a hypocrite like all of us. I hope not as much a hypocrite as the person I'm going to start assassinating. But of course we're all a hypocrite in personal relationships, often to save other people's feelings, but not as bad as cruelty. I wanted to focus today on the liberal left, really, who are the hypocrites that most get under my skin, because they're hypocritical with enormous self-righteousness. And this is really epitomized for me by The Guardian, particularly in the shape of its panjandrum, Alan Rushbridger. And he's in a fine line of people who care desperately, they tell us, about the underclass, the poor, the neglected. And somehow or other, because of their liberal ideologies, end up pulling the rug out from under these people. So going back a long time to the 60s, it's Anthony Crossland, from a very privileged background, saying, I'm going to destroy every fucking grammar school in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. And of course, his reasons for doing this was that he didn't approve of selectivity and he wanted equality. But the point was, he was of that class of ideologue who destroys before they build. And hence, they wrecked a system of education that was very rough on some people, but worked for others, and replaced it by something that wasn't thought through, and that Secretaries of State for Education have been wrestling with ever since. It's that kind of ideology, for instance, that caused New Labour to get rid of the assisted places in public schools, which at least were benefiting quite a lot of poor students who were getting an education as good as anyone else's. Another area in which people like that have been driving me mad forever, really, was, until quite recently, an issue like female genital mutilation, where well-educated liberal voices would say, it is not for us to condemn, we're all cultural relativists, whatever their culture is, it's fine. And you would sit there saying, this is going back 20 years, you would say they are chopping bits off girls and ruining their lives, and the voice would say, you mustn't be judgmental. And this would usually be from the most judgmental person that one knew. The sort of judgmental person who actually despises the traditional white working class in this country and has always made their contempt clear. The person who, in very recent days, would have been most contemptuous of Tommy Robinson, of the English Defence League. Certainly, Robinson has left the English Defence League because so many thugs came on board. But there wasn't actually anything wrong with ordinary white working class people, not all white actually, indigenous you might say, and there were Sikhs in it, I think. There were locals in Luton. Luton was a place which had become unrecognisable to the English working class, and it was also a place which had some extremely unpleasant Islamist preachers and demonstrators, and they were merely trying to stand up against what they thought was an erosion of the values of their country, and somehow they became absolutely the only bad guys, and they all became thugs because a few thugs were associated with them. Gillian Duffy, I'd like to remind you all about Gillian Duffy. She was on television in 2010 when Gordon Brown was introduced to her in Rochdale, and she said she was worried about aspects of Rochdale, and where, she said, were all these, and she paused. I watched this live, and I watched it over and over again. She actually paused. She said, Eastern Europeans. She said, where are they all flocking from? Now, she was a lifelong Labour supporter. She was a perfectly decent woman. She was not saying anything outrageous. She was just essentially saying to the Prime Minister, I'm worried about the level of immigration. And he then, if you remember, retired to his car and said she was a bigoted woman. Now, what was significant about that was that Gillian Duffy hesitated before she said Eastern European, because there were very few Eastern Europeans in Rochdale. The problem there has been actually a tremendous influx of Pakistanis. And the Rochdale grooming was going on at the time, the grooming of young women, and it wasn't being talked about. It was never talked about in the liberal media because it was somehow racist to do so. But she didn't actually have the nerve, even though she was a forthright woman, to say what the problem really was. I mean, God knows what he'd have called her if she'd mentioned East Asian immigration. I would classify an awful lot of this as a guardianista approach to things, which also tends to censor the views that they find disgusting, which are the views from below. The people who like the monarchy and wish that we celebrated St. George's Day and were very unhappy with multiculturalism and don't like forced secularism. But in the name of caring, there is the righteousness. And Alan Rushbridger has actually excelled himself, I think, recently in being in favour of press regulation for the first time in 300 years, because really some of these papers that the ordinary people read are just too ghastly and vulgar. And that's really why he hates them. At the same time, he thinks he's perfectly entitled in The Guardian to leak stories and intelligence information which somebody like Jack Straw thinks is utterly undermining of the state and is adolescent arrogance. That, I think, is one of the finest pieces of hypocrisy we have on stage at the moment, and I don't like it. Thank you.
Okay, Joe Frigieri.
The issue I'd like to discuss is the one raised by the question whether we should be judging people by what they do in their private lives rather than by their public achievements or lack of them. This is a narrower and more focused question than the one about hypocrisy. The question that is whether it is always possible or even at all possible for politicians to avoid acting hypocritically in their public role as politicians, or indeed whether it may not sometimes be desirable for them to do so. This bigger question has a long history in the field of moral and political philosophy. Thrasymachus, for example, in Book 1 of Plato's Republic, tries unsuccessfully to defend the view that acting unjustly is what politicians ought to do in pursuit of their own interest, because that is exactly what everybody else does. Adeimantus, one of Plato's two brothers in the dialogue, mitigates that theory precisely by defending the hypocritical claim that in order to safeguard their reputation, politicians ought to seem to be acting justly while committing injustice, at which point Glaucon, the other brother, becomes the first staunch defender of realpolitik by claiming that nothing would stop people from committing the most horrible crimes to usurp the throne if they could find a ring that made them invisible, and that it is only for prudential reasons that they don't do it. Machiavelli argues along the same lines. The prince should tell the truth when he can, but must be prepared to lie if he must. By occasionally telling the truth, he would give his subjects the impression that that's what he's doing, that he's telling the truth when he lies. A prime example of the hypocritical stance par excellence. We can think of quite a few examples of that kind of behavior. The employer who leads a campaign in favor of an equal opportunities labor policy while practicing unfair and unjust discrimination between his employees at the workplace is acting hypocritically. So is the bishop who preaches the evangelical virtue of poverty while spending 31 million euro on his new residence next to the cathedral, more than 6 times the original estimate. And so is the self-styled environmentalist who strikes a lucrative deal with property developers. But not all cases of double standards are like that. Not all stories involving a clash between an individual's clean public image and his shady private moral practices follow the same pattern. Stories differ in all sorts of ways, and it is such differences that explain why people are prepared to put up with public-private behavioral discrepancies in some cases, but not in others. Bill Clinton provides a good example of a discrepancy many Americans were prepared to put up with. His second term in office was constantly plagued by media attention focusing on his reckless personal decisions. Despite managing a successful economy and registering surpluses in 4 out of his 8 years in office, Clinton was unable to put a stop to his personal scandals, which included the Monica Lewinsky affair. The assumption was, so Clinton's standing as a politician was not unduly affected, in spite of all that. The assumption was that his immoral private life could be ignored if, in economic terms, he was delivering the goods. If Bill Clinton managed, more or less, to get away with it, not so Nixon after Watergate, a scandal to do with spying, break-ins, and burglary. In Clinton's case, his private misdeeds were not perceived as entering into conflict with his performance as a politician. In Nixon's, the misdeeds amounted to a professional crime, and people saw it for what it was. What the Clinton case also shows us is that the traditional distinction between the private and the public spheres has all but collapsed, and that the grounds upon which that distinction rested have been eroded. While it is possible to lament the fact and see it as an infringement on individual rights, or as the invasion of one area of one's being which until recently one used to consider one's own, it is also possible to welcome the change as an indication that a higher degree of transparency, consistency, and integrity is expected from those who occupy positions of power, politicians, churchmen, and others who are expected to lead by example. One of the key beliefs in psychology, philosophy, and medicine, and other disciplines, but also in popular understandings, has to do with consistency and integrity. Think of a word like integrity, for example. A divided self is thought to be a bad thing, a kind of Hamlet who ends up in grief. A number of neuroses actually have to do with that, schizophrenia, for example, or bipolar disorders. So what's wrong with a politician who was all for gender equality but privileged his sons over his daughters, say. He works well as a clinician or a technician. That is, his politics are sound enough, and we would do well to heed and follow them. Self is where he comes unstuck. He still hasn't managed to come to terms with himself, which doesn't mean, which doesn't mean that he will never get elected. That all depends on how he manages the incongruence. But it is an incongruence, and journalists are normally among the first to notice it and among the best to bring it out. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Michael Fitzpatrick.
You may think it's strange to have a doctor on a platform talking about hypocrisy. I was interested to discover Bernard Mandeville, one of the great historical authorities on hypocrisy, was, of course, himself qualified as a doctor, and he regarded the medical profession as the most hypocritical of all vocations. As he said, the very small gap between Hippocratic principles and hypocritic principles. And that his experience as in the medical profession gave him a very wide understanding of double standards, and a whole range and variety of human hypocrisies were all evident in the daily practice of the medical profession. And I think that's very familiar. The most, I suppose, contemporary illustration of that is the way in which doctors provide moralistic exhortations to their parents to live healthy lifestyles, whilst themselves being known for their somewhat dissolute personal lives. I have to confess I'm sometimes subject to an opposite criticism, which is, although I have some reputation as a campaigner against healthy living, people are really disgusted to see me arrive on the bike and say, Mike, you're such a hypocrite. And even more disgusted to discover I don't smoke and I'm not actually completely an alcoholic. It's regarded as a real sellout, and I've really betrayed them. But I think that there's no doubt that medical practice does give you a considerable exposure to what Judith Shklar calls the ordinary vices, the different varieties of insincerity, duplicity, dissembling that exist on this troubled interface between the private and the public spheres. And doctors know very well too, that as T.S. Eliot says, humankind cannot bear very much reality. Doctors know that truth can be a very corrosive quantity. It can be very dangerous. And there's a familiar phrase used to be appeared in a court case recently as a common kind of disparagement of contemporary politics about a politician who was said to be economical with the truth. But actually, in medical practice, you need to be economical with the truth. To not be economical with the truth is, to go back to Ruth's point, is to give way to the greater vice of cruelty, because the truth can be very cruel sometimes, and you need to be discreet and tactful in your dispensation of the commodity of truth in your dealings with human beings. And we know this in our personal lives. As I say, doctors know this in their professional relationships. It's in politics that, as most of this discussion has focused, that this whole thing, discussion becomes much more evident. It's particularly a problem, of course, of liberal democratic societies. Hypocrisy is not a problem of military dictatorships. Politicians don't need to disguise what they're doing. But it's a feature of any sort of political world which depends on politics as the art of persuasion, because there's inevitably an element of theatricality about that, an element of spin, of the putting on of some sort of performance, an act, wearing a mask. These are features of inevitable features of democratic politics. And there's also a sense that democratic politics raises expectations which inevitably lead to disappointment, and that disappointment is often expressed in a sense of personal betrayal and allegations that politicians have been hypocritical. I think we live in a particular moment where, because of the general the troubled boundary between the public and the private, is at a particularly difficult state in our contemporary politics, that there is a sense of the decline of the role of ideological conflict, even real traditional party politics in traditional politics. And there's a much greater sense of the image, the charisma of the politician, the performance on the TV couch becomes much more important. And you see this. What you see is what the wearing of a mask in politics, which used to be in a much more limited and way in which kind of everybody knew the rules of the game. It's a bit, you think back, Winston Churchill always had the cigar, Harold Wilson smoked a pipe. Everybody knows that neither of them ever lit the cigar or the pipe. It was just an image. They put on this sort of avuncular, particular sort of image, and that was just part of the act of being a politician. If you look at politicians like Tony Blair or Bill Clinton, they've particularly made this performance of sincerity in the sense that they believe the mask, that their display of sincerity and openness plays some sort of independent role in justifying their political position. And this is what, going back to Mandeville, Mandeville distinguished between hypocrisy, first-order hypocrisy, as some have called it, and hypocrisy about hypocrisy, second-order hypocrisy, which he argued was a much more damaging thing. And I think that's what we see plays a much greater role in contemporary political life and is much more damaging. It's not so much the routine hypocrisy of politics, but the way in which politics are hypocritical about it. Just two brief examples of that. Blair, of course, is the politician most abused for, I have to do this quickly, most abused for his so-called hypocrisy and for his personal failings. Because one of the features of contemporary politics, which we should just emphasize in all these discussions, it's much easier to expose hypocrisy than it is to challenge people's political convictions or their ideology. But Blair's particularly associated with this, and the most famous example of this is the pretext of weapons of mass destruction, the dodgy dossier on which he went to war in Iraq in 2003. Now, that to me is first-order hypocrisy, the routine hypocrisy of every British government that's ever gone to war anywhere to present a case of that nature. Kind of everybody knows the score about that sort of hypocrisy. The second-order hypocrisy, the hypocrisy about hypocrisy, I would say is in the not in my name protests of the liberal anti-war protests that took place in response to that. Because for 10 years before the Iraq War, that whole body of opinion had called for liberal, what they call liberal humanitarian intervention by British forces in a whole range of countries from in the previous Gulf War, in the Balkans, in other places where indeed there was British involvement, other places where there wasn't, Somalia, other places. And so the hypocrisy of the not in my name demonstration, in a way, was even worse than the hypocrisy of Tony Blair, because what it did was to discredit any legitimate anti-imperialist opposition to those sort of military activities of the sort which had existed in the past, but which was, it seems to me, discredited by this this posturing about being opposed to war without its genuine content. The final example relates to Gordon Brown and the release of al-Megrahi, the so-called Lockerbie bomber, to Libya in 2009. Now that, again, the release of al-Megrahi, which everybody sort of knew the score, that there was some deal done about it. There was obvious British economic interest in the oil deals with Libya. It was fitted that whole process, so he was released. There was nothing particularly unusual about that. What was unusual, and this is the hypocrisy about hypocrisy, was the way in which the responsibility of that decision was outsourced, and the whole kind of blame for it was put on some junior Scottish government minister who had to appear to justify the whole thing, and that it was all to do with the Scottish legal system and its particular workings, which everybody knew was not the case, but he was lumbered with the responsibility for doing it. And what that sort of hypocrisy represents is the evasion of responsibility by the British government, by the British ruling elite, of responsibility for its actions in relation to an important issue of foreign policy. There's a sort of abdication of authority at the root of that, which is much more profound than the wheeler dealing involved in, as I say, the routine hypocrisy of releasing somebody like al-Megrahi under the terms that it was done. That's more corrosive because it actually is part of a wider process in society. It sets the tone for an abdication of authority throughout society in the way which has become a corrosive feature of modern life. So I think that when we're looking at hypocrisy, we should enjoy the exposure of the sexual foibles of our politicians, but we should look for the hypocrisy about hypocrisy, because that's a much more damaging problem.
Thank you. finally, Anne Atkins.
What's wrong with hypocrisy is the title of our afternoon seminar. And I just want to deal with a couple of things before coming on to that question. What is not wrong? What we're not, I believe, attacking is, for instance, idealism. The subtitle is do as I do, not as I, or the surtitle really, do as I do, not as I say, do as I say, not as I do. In a sense, there's nothing wrong with that. Teachers, parents, clergy, anybody setting an example will have an ideal which none of us can live up to. So to say, to your child, actually do as I say, because I can't even live up to, I can't live up to my own ideals, nobody can, is not a wrong sort of hypocrisy. Nor is the sort of bravery of the traditional British stiff upper lip, which I think we heard in the news this week is now going out of fashion. But, how are you? I'm fine, is not, a lie in that sense, is not a hypocrisy in that sense, nor is sort of protecting children from, I don't particularly believe in protecting children from things, but we have friends whose father was arrested at dawn. He was actually one of the Blue Arrow. I don't know if you remember this case, and they were eventually vindicated, but they kept that from their children. I wouldn't do that, but I could respect why they did. That's not hypocrisy of this sort of damaging kind, nor indeed is discretion. I thought it was a shame, for instance, that Prince Charles and Lady Diana both talked about their affairs in public because, the affair was wrong, but to talk about it was another wrong because it suggested it almost suggested that wasn't wrong, that they could sort of, not exactly brag about it, but that it wasn't. Sometimes if you do something wrong, you should be ashamed of it and not wash your dirty linen in public. So that's not what we're talking about. Just to come on to Joe's question about private life versus public, does it matter if public figures are found to be hypocritical? Yes, I think it does. Yes and no. It depends what we're employing that person to do. If somebody is a wonderful brain surgeon, but a terrible husband, we still want to employ him as a brain surgeon because he's still doing a lot of good. He's doing a lot of harm at home, but he's doing a lot of good in the theatre. But if somebody is, again, let's take the example of a clergyman is beating his wife. No, he shouldn't be a clergyman because part of his role is to teach Christian morals. If a headmaster is an adulterer, I think he should step down because he's there to teach values such as fidelity. Now, there's a grey area. Bill Clinton, personally, I would not have wanted Bill Clinton as one of our political leaders because I think fidelity is more important to our happiness than the economics. In a country where we don't starve, most of us, I think, marital fidelity is more important to our happiness. So I would not vote for a politician who was cheating on his wife. But that is a grey area. Footballers, does it matter if they play great football, but they had sex with their colleague's wife? Yes, I think it does, because they're more important than the football they play is the example they're setting to young, teenagers. But you could disagree with that. But to come on to what I find the most interesting bit of this question, what is wrong with hypocrisy? When I asked myself to answer that question, it was so blindingly obvious that hypocrisy is wrong that I struggled, prove the sky's blue. We all hate hypocrisy. So I then asked myself the question, why do we hate it so much? Now, I suspect, I could be wrong, this is pure speculation, but a lot of our values, even if we don't hold to the faith, are based on hundreds of years of Christianity and Christian teaching. And I find it fascinating that Jesus Christ seemed to hate hypocrisy more than anything else, more even, I think, Ruth, than cruelty. Now, that is fascinating. He attacked the hypocrites, the play actors, more than the cheats, more than the sexual cheats or the financial cheats, more than the murderers that he hung across next to a murderer, and he didn't condemn him, but he condemned the hypocrites. He hated this play acting. And he was talking about something much more subtle and low-key than we're talking about. He was talking about the play acting of the good people who stood at street corners praying to show how good they were, or gave alms publicly to show how good they are. Why did he hate it so much? And I think you put your finger on it, Ruth, when you used the word self-righteous. I think he hated the self-righteousness of it, the I'm okay, I'm good side of it. And I think that's what's at the heart of this, of why we hate it so much. And just to push what you said slightly further, Ruth, because I found fascinating what you said. Your first instinct was that you hate this more than anything, even cruelty, and then you were brought up short on that. But I think your first instinct was right. Let's consider some of the examples that have been mentioned. Female genital mutilation. That is terribly cruel. The Iraq War, caused by hypocrisy. Cruelty on a massive scale. And I think that there's a reason why we hate this so much is because it's at the root of much human evil. And that may sound an extreme statement, but I have to ask myself why Jesus Christ hated this so much. And I would just finish on a little example of him deconstructing this play acting, this hypocrisy, this self-righteousness, when they brought to him a woman taken in adultery, for which the Old Testament punishment was death by stoning, not just death, but a horrible death, of having rocks thrown at you. Now just consider the hypocrisy behind that. You cannot, ladies and gentlemen, take one person in adultery. It's not possible. So Jesus was attacking the cruelty against that woman, the hypocrisy of why they were picking on the woman, not the more powerful person in that relationship. And the hypocrisy of saying they were okay, but she was the sinner. And he deconstructed that by saying, okay, any of you who are not sinners can carry out that execution.
That's interesting. There's been a couple of mentions of Bill Clinton. I want to ask Joe about that. But before I do that, let's pick up on this theme since Hans picked up on Ruth's idea about self-righteousness. Ruth, you also mentioned specifically that the liberal left is particularly offensive to you, or maybe it should be to all of us. And that has to do with self-righteousness and people who are very judgmental of others while claiming to be anti-judgmental. Does that seem to you more problematic, more heinous as a form of hypocrisy than, say, the conservative cabinet minister of decades ago who would be homosexual while ruling about family values?
Personally, I find it more objectionable because it's almost all-encompassing. And because, on the whole, the cabinet minister, he knows he's a weak vessel. He knows he's got to say certain things in public. It doesn't get to me in the way that, nor does Bill Clinton's behaviour actually get to me in the way that the liberal left righteous do. And they do it because their whole thing is they are wiser, they are better educated, they are more intelligent, they are more caring, they are more compassionate, all those things than anyone else. It is very hard to have a disagreement with people like that. I mean, I have friends to the right of me, if you can believe that, quite a few. I have no problem in having rows with them. I have no problem in having differences with what I'd call the old Labour aspect of the left. Old Labour left, no problem at all. You can have lots of disputes about... I have lots of friends who come into that category. But to sit at an Islington dinner party and say something that is unfashionable requires really courage. You really do. I remember a friend of mine who had great courage in that respect ringing me up after one of those events and saying, "Darling, I decided to go for it, and I defended the Vietnam War in retrospect, and Margaret Drabble, she swelled up like a bullfrog." And that's the point. They cannot believe it. I don't know how many of you have found this. You might have found this, Anne, but you meet new people. There's a group of 3 or 4 of you. And if they're, if I may so describe them, as Islington left, they will assume that everybody in this gathering agrees with them, because it isn't possible that anybody in a civilized place wouldn't have their civilized opinions. So they will automatically say what a ghastly person I don't know, Cameron is, or, you know, what really makes you sick is. Now, I wouldn't do that with a group of strangers. I know I'm doing it here, but I'm supposed to be being provoking here.
No, but you're not assuming.
I'm not assuming. I wouldn't sit at a dinner party with a whole range of people and suddenly throw into it the assumption that we all agreed on something. That's impolite. You listen. It's just impolite. So that's why they irritate me so much, massively. I want to put in one word about Clinton, though. Well, actually, could I put in two? Chinaman. The first is, and of course, what he gets away with so much because he's so incredibly charming. And somebody who saw him at the Hey on Why thing said that he was actually asked how he could be so stupid and wrong as to get involved with Monica Lewinsky. And he looked at the audience and he said, because I could. And it's very hard not to warm to somebody who says that. The second thing is he was a frightful cheat on the golf course. And that was bad.
And now, is that worse?
I think it's probably tricky, but in principle, yes.
Well, Joe, let me bring in you on Clinton, because Mike characterised politicians like Blair and Clinton as carrying out a performance of sincerity. And that touches a little on what you talked about, integrity and incongruence. So a figure like, was it a particular problem for Clinton because he was supposed to be sincere, whereas Tricky Dicky had always been?
Yeah, I tried to bring out the reasons why Clinton managed to survive and Nixon was thrown out. I mean, and I summed it up by saying that Nixon was found guilty of a professional crime, whereas Clinton could get away with it. But let's also get clear about what Clinton did. I mean, I have a list here, and I just didn't want to elaborate. But for example, apart from the humiliation suffered by all the people concerned, including his wife, but not just her, Monica Lewinsky herself and her family, there were issues of public concern related to adulterous and promiscuous behavior in a theoretically monogamous society, let's say theoretically monogamous, but also related to the abuse of power, to skewed power relations, and also to lying under oath. So, but I did say why I still believed that Clinton got away with it and Nixon didn't. And the second point I wanted to make was this. And I related the point that was being raised earlier. When parents tell their children, for example, not to cheat, they don't do it all the time. Some people encourage them to do, actually. But if parents tell their children you should never cheat, right, and then they're caught cheating themselves, I think that does remove a lot of the authority of the parents as far as that is concerned, because they're supposed to be role models. They're supposed to be setting an example. And that's the difference between whether you'd go, for example, to a very successful family therapist, even though you knew that he was having problems at home, because he's a very good technician or clinician. But then would you vote for a politician who was caught lying about the things he's saying in public? And the worst, of course, the worst thing, and I agree on this, if there's a politician who gives you all the reasons in the world for going to war against the country, and then you discover that he was lying through his teeth, or that there was no reason at all why he should have gone, unfortunately, you discover that only when it's too late. But those are two reasons. In the second case, obviously, the act becomes much more despicable. And if one knew beforehand what the facts were, then one, of course, wouldn't have voted that politician in for a second term. And this is where I think journalists have a great job to do. But then, of course, as you know, journalists are also split into at least 2, if not 4 camps, and they report depending on who's their paymaster.
Let me bring that back to you, because you had what seemed to me quite a tough line in terms of which profession needs to have integrity. So you've got the brain surgeon, that's fairly technical.
Yeah.
The footballer, some would see as more technical, or they may be perhaps more worried about cheating on the field than cheating in the domestic sense.
Yeah.
I mean, where do you draw the line? What makes integrity important?
Well, I suppose I'm drawing the line at the things I think are important. I mean, I think sexual fidelity is more important than football. But then I'm not much of a football fan. You know, I don't expect you all to agree with me. But and as I indicated earlier, I think in a privileged, rich Western democracy where we're not starving, again, I think marital fidelity is more important than the economy because, I mean, it wouldn't be if your children were starving, no. But ours are not. And I think marital fidelity is far more important to my happiness and no doubt yours than my... whether I'm able to, you know, as long as I can feed my children, whether I can buy this kind of car or I only can buy a bicycle, you know. So I suppose I am setting the bar quite high. I mean, I mentioned Prince Charles. I mean, I personally think Prince Charles should abdicate because I think the role of the monarch in our constitutional democracy is much more important. The example, you know, I know this is a very modern thing since Victoria and Albert, but this example of setting a model family is probably as important as the political freedom that the Queen is, you know, the safety net for. But I don't expect everybody to agree with me. But that's where a road sweeper, it doesn't matter. It matters to his family if he's horrible, but it doesn't matter to how clean the road is. But teachers and police, you know, I mean, the police, another grey area. We want them to prevent crime. Yes, we do. But actually, I think what happened over Andrew Mitchell was extremely shocking. Extremely shocking. And however good those policemen are at solving crime, you know, look at the damage they've done by lying in such a privileged job. So, yeah, but as I say, I wouldn't expect everybody on this panel or in this room to agree with me there.
Okay, thanks. Mike, do you want to respond to any of that? And perhaps you could say a bit more about the second order hypocrisy and what makes it, and does it relate to this discussion about integrity?
Well, I think it does. I think we do feel a strong kind of personal revulsion against hypocrisy, very strongly, and a number of people have emphasised that. But I think we also, it's very important to understand the development of the role of hypocrisy in the public sphere, and to appreciate, as one commentator, Judith Sklar, who's written a very authoritative on this question, makes the point, hypocrisy actually bolsters liberal democracy. You cannot have liberal democracy without hypocrisy. That's a very important point to grasp. And this goes back to Hobbes and the whole sense of the authority of the state, the stability of the state, sometimes depends upon the politicians behaving in a way which would be construed as being hypocritical. Cromwell was castigated historically as one of the great hypocrites because of the way in which he seemed to advance his particular political agenda in a disguised way, concealing his agenda and his objectives, is in some respects the founder of the liberal democracy that we enjoy in British society. A contentious point perhaps, but certainly played a very important role in that.
Thomas or Oliver?
Oliver, I'm talking about Oliver. Thomas was also highly hypocritical, but in a more, devious, but, probably also played a significant role and had a certain sense of the authority of the state, of being the highest calling. But
can I just quiz you on this? Because you talk of it being essential. I mean, why is it? Would it not be better if we didn't have this play acting? I mean, particularly now that when everything is under so much scrutiny, 50 or 100 years ago, politicians could get away with and monarchs could get away with an awful lot more than they can today. Was that better?
Well, I don't think it's not play acting. It's about, and it's like the whole thing about spin in terms of how politicians present. The art of persuasion depends on presenting a case in argument, in debate, in a leadership, elite circles, in terms of the relationship between politics and the public, which must inevitably have a putting on a face, necessarily presenting things in a particular way, which is not necessary. It has to be economical with the truth. The conduct of foreign policy in any advanced state must be economical with the truth in how it proceeds. It can't proceed in any other way. To demand total transparency in the operation of politics is to render the operation of politics unworkable.
But then you're defining hypocrisy slightly differently from the rest of us. I mean, you can present the facts in a favourable way while still having complete integrity. I mean, the way you fill in your CV can be, you have great integrity, but you don't put the negative bits. That's okay, that's honest.
Well, I think, you can, there's different, you can have an integrity in your personal private sphere, but integrity in the personal sphere is going to be defined in a different way in that case.
But what I'm suggesting is that you can have integrity in the way that you present things, to sell your idea to the public. That doesn't involve the sort of hypocrisy where I think the rest of us are criticising, that is a deceitful kind of.
Well, other people, one person's spin is another person's deceit. That's to some extent a subjective judgment. But people will present things in a particular way, which involves discretion, calculation, dissimulation, inevitably in some respect. And that's what people. I think the people who've argued for this in relation to the operation of politics say is inescapable. You can't operate politics without that. And to try and hold politicians to a higher standard in that regard is to make the political system unworkable, it seems to me.
Okay, Ruth wants to come in. I'll come to the audience quite soon.
It's just on this point. I can't remember how many centuries ago it was that the definition of an ambassador was given, which is that an ambassador is a man sent abroad to lie for his country. And that is, in a way, what diplomacy is about. And the Assange leaking of all those diplomatic cables actually completely undermined diplomacy because the diplomatic letters that he was leaking were actually honest letters home from diplomats to their own country, saying this is the scene here. And they were getting retrospectively into terrible trouble for telling uncomfortable truths. So this isn't an easy one.
Well, and I think that the point that emerged from that, you cannot operate a foreign policy on the basis of total transparency. You cannot run the democratic politics on that basis. It's just not conceivable, not feasible.
I could be wrong, but isn't the quotation a good man sent abroad to lie for his country? And does that make a difference?
I don't remember good being in, but I don't think it makes it. I don't think it actually makes any difference. You can't do it unless you are. I'm sorry, but economical with the truth. You cannot be an utterly frank and transparent ambassador.
Okay, show of hands, please.
What was interesting with the Climategate scandal a few years ago, leakage of emails from some of which were from climatologists working at the University of East Anglia. Many people defended these climatologists' collusion in using the peer review process to obstruct the publication of papers that went against their advocacy on various issues in relation to climate change. Many people defended them and said that what they were doing was justified. They were also attacked for being reluctant to invest time and resources in replying to freedom of information requests with which they were bombarded daily. People said it was terrible, they weren't being sufficiently transparent. I remember thinking this was entirely the wrong way around, that the collusion in the use of the peer review process was a lamentable thing, but that these people should be under no obligation to spend their time answering these freedom of information requests, which wouldn't have revealed any wrongdoing in any case. That was a distraction from their job, which is to be climate scientists. And I remember the competing accounts of integrity and thinking that things were the wrong way round. I think it's an interesting example. My question to the panel is whether there's any mileage in talking not so much about hypocrisy, first order or second order or what have you, but about whether good faith and bad faith are useful categories. Good faith, you can define it many ways, but generous but honest and realistic expectations of yourself and of others, as against contemptuous view of people and of people's capacities. I think it's interesting that realpolitik, at least to my mind, isn't necessarily associated with bad faith, but perhaps the panel disagree with that.
Would you say it's hypocritical for someone to try and make themselves look better than they really are? I'm just thinking if around the room here, if we were all stripped naked and washed, most people here have come here after making quite an attempt to impress people in some way. Is that hypocritical? Particularly if you're trying to marry someone.
We seem to have become more sensitive to the problem of hypocrisy in politics. And I wonder if this is to do with the collapsing of the personal and the political, but also because there's very little else on which to judge politicians. The party leaders are almost indistinguishable in terms of their political visions, in terms of their policies, and so therefore it's perfectly natural that people will look to their personal lives as the only basis on which to make a judgment.
I'm wondering whether, like, partly what underlies our instinctive revulsion to hypocrisy in certain areas, especially in domestic politics. I think that it's probably not worth conflating domestic and international politics, because in domestic politics we're supposed to argue over what's right, whereas in international politics is essentially a state of nature, and it's not a question of right, it's a question of might. But perhaps what underlies our revulsion to hypocrisy is the idea that if we're guided by ideals, and we're claiming to be guided by those ideals, how could we fail to then live by them? And there seems to so the ancient Greeks were fascinated with Acrasia, the idea that you could do something else than what you judge to be the best. And in Kant as well, and people who have generally just reflected on what it's like to think have been led down a path that's been instinctually against hypocrisy. So I think that if being guided and searching after some sort of truth is important, then how could, when you fail to realise it's right, not live up to that expectation of yourself? So perhaps that's what underlies our revulsion at hypocrisy.
Okay, thanks. I'll let the panel respond before coming back. So, Anne, would you like to go first?
Oh, yes, just picking up on that very interesting example of the climate change scientists, my understanding of that situation, and I have a friend who works very closely in this area, was that really it was a storm in a teacup, whipped up, if you whip storms up, I think you do, by the climate skeptics, and was really completely irrelevant. I mean, these emails were basically, as you say, busy academics, say, one of them writing to another saying, I mean, climate change is a very complex issue. And we public are pretty stupid, right? And if you've only got a soundbite to get it out to people, you've got to get the right message out. If you've got this much information and this much time, you've got to present it in the right way. And my understanding is that that's what those emails were about. They were not out to, deceive the mass public. And it was just made to look that way because, quite a number of us don't want to believe in climate change. So, but I think it's a very interesting example. Just briefly on these two, we're tussling with, the good faith, bad faith issue. Is it good hypocrisy or bad hypocrisy? I think a touchstone is it self-seeking? The good man sent abroad to lie for his country is doing this for the greater good, in theory, whereas the politician who lies about his affair is doing it for his own career. And I think that puts a different light on it. And then also this other point that was picked up on, if he's espousing family values in public, but having an affair with his secretary in private, the reason that gives us a bad taste in the mouth is because we know that then he doesn't believe it. Now, if somebody is espousing family values and has a lapse, a one-night stand, and hugely regrets it, and, this was a great mistake, that's a bit different. That's somebody having an ideal, and we all struggle to live up to our ideals. But a man or woman who's publicly espousing family values and persisting in the opposite behaviour clearly is not giving that message out and is not believing it. So I think that's another important difference too.
I'd like to insist a little bit more about this difference between, for example, why we're happy to go to the family therapist, even though we know he has a problem with his family at home, but we're not happy to vote for a politician who's caught cheating on important matters when he's giving us information, bad information, about very important things like, for example, whether a country should go to war or not. I think this is crucial, you see. And also there's a difference between not telling the whole truth or keeping part of it, not revealing the whole truth, which I understand in some situations may just be necessary. A difference between that and lying, telling a barefaced lie straightforward to your teeth when such an important matter is concerned. That is, you're going to go to war and you know that hundreds, thousands of people are going to lose their lives. And I think that we must make that distinction. We shouldn't then go on talking about whether it's hypocritical to go to a doctor who you know is a good family doctor, but then you know that he has problems. That's not really important because he's a clinician, a therapist, working from a body of expert knowledge. But when we come to politics, what we're dealing with there is representation. I mean, we expect politicians in a way to represent us. We expect them to have a kind of collective persona. It's not just them talking for themselves. So that is a very important difference, I think, which we should keep in mind. And the problem, as I said, is that we discover that politicians have been lying very often after all the harm has been done.
I'd just like to pick up on the gentleman who is concerned that by trying to look better than we were, we might be hypocrites. I think one really owes it to the people one is meeting not to look as hideous as one might. But on the other hand, if I were actually trying to attract somebody into marriage, I hope I wouldn't pretend to have, I wouldn't have boob jobs and lie about them. I utterly agree with the gentleman in the front about the climate change thing. I think there has been an enormous amount of suppression of debate on the whole climate change thing. Speaking as somebody who's described as a denier, I don't deny that there's climate change. There's obviously climate change. Any fool can see that. The question is it man-made? And the question is it actually harmful? And I do recommend you to The Spectator this week, a really excellent article by Matt Ridley on that subject. But what was wrong there was that they were letting science down by actually distorting arguments, suppressing questions. That's an offence against the faith of science, if you like. Politicians, I just want to put in a bit of a word for them. I think some people who become politicians have an excess of testosterone. And I think it must be extremely difficult if you've got an excess of testosterone to be in Parliament and be lonely with your family at the other end of the country. I think, of course, in an ideal world, marital fidelity is an absolutely excellent thing. But I don't think that John Major should have had to resign as a cabinet minister because he was having it off with Edwina Currie. We all have strange tastes.
Yes, but Ruth, my difficulty with that is I can't take seriously. Once I know that he wears blue Y-fronts.
But he didn't. That was made up by Max Clifford, I think.
But you see that I can't think of Bill Clinton now without thinking of him with his trousers down, actually. And, do you want... so I can't... I find it hard to respect...
I understand what you're saying, but isn't that because people are leaking all sorts of details about people's private lives that perhaps we could do that? I mean, I do find my first profession wasn't a journalist, but it's a serious part of my life now, being a journalist. And really, talk about hypocrites. Journalists leaking politicians' expenses and really destroying all faith in politicians. For God's sake, it used to be a joke in Fleet Street, the way that journalists fiddled expenses. And they are really intolerable when they're being more righteous than politicians. Journalists delight in dragging down the reputation of politicians, and the result, and the BBC, my God, what was more hypocritical than the BBC, which takes such a high moral line on politicians, paying managers an enormous sums of illegal money, actually. Politicians, in the end, we won't have any left who are worth a damn if we're going to apply to them standards that most of us couldn't live up to. And at the moment, they are so frightened, they're afraid. I mean, at the moment, there's a row because David Cameron said something about wearing a jumper indoors. Because that might reduce energy costs or something. And now he's being lighted on by convoys of journalists, and there will be commentaries about it tomorrow. For God's sake, give the guys a break.
Okay, Mike?
I very much agree with much of what Ruth said there. I think it seems to me to be quite absurd to create a situation where we may hold people to standards in public life that are widely ignored in private life by most people in relation to...
I don't think most people are committing adultery.
Well, the rate of marital breakdown is running at about 50%.
No,
so,
it's under 50%. Most marriages still last for life.
But that's... Yes, but it's a very substantial minority,
Okay, but it's not most people.
No, but it's getting on that way. And, if you've got you could quibble whether it's 30 or 40%, but whatever, it's a very high proportion of people don't succeed in maintaining a lifelong monogamous relationship. And so to expect people in public political life and professions to maintain a standard different from what a very substantial minority of people can't do in private life seems to me to be absurd.
These guys are in a very privileged position, and women, not just guys, but they're in an extremely privileged position, and they're in an extremely important position. And I think there is something to be said for looking up to people in those kind of positions. I don't think that's too much to ask.
Okay, brief response from Mike, then I'm going to come back up.
Yeah, but you see, I sometimes yearn for the day a politician resigns or loses office because of some political misdemeanour, rather than something to do with their sex life. I just don't care about Chaz and Di and John Major and you know, John Major and whatever her name was, you know, I would like to get those images out of my head too, you know.
Well, I care because of the coming back to it, because of the cruelty of it. I think Diana suffered terribly.
Well,
and I think that really matters.
Okay, the audience is getting restive.
Okay, I actually wanted to bring it down to a bit of the personal, not the private. I think on the individual level, not just politicians, a lot of young people especially, because of the social media and the prevalence of it, are learning to project a different public image, the private image. I'll take, for instance, a lot of young, say, Muslim women who may leave their home dressed up in a headscarf and everything, and they get to university and it goes off. And I've got quite a few students like this. So I think maybe the discussion of hypocrisy needs to look at the different hues. Maybe what we're talking about is not just outright lying, but actually making a decision what is public, what is private. A lot of teachers, a lot of professionals have to uphold certain standards publicly as their role, but that doesn't mean they are actually hypocritical, because on a personal level, in their private lives, they have other activities they may engage in. So I think it is actually far more complex than just politicians lying. And it is about how we are all managing the private-public divide in a world where the public and private are increasingly merging.
Isn't it very self-righteous to condemn self-righteousness? And isn't that in itself hypocritical?
I think Jesus would have said that.
I think, yes.
So there seems to be a lot of focus on the people being judged and us as the judges, but it was briefly brought up, the media, they're the ones that are making this, highlighting this for all of us. As a teacher, I wonder whether the means justify the end. I see the kids, not seeing them do the bad acts, but reading about it in the paper, and I wonder about the effects this is having on them.
Just to follow on from some of the things that were said by Ruth and by Anne, I mean, I think most of us would agree that extreme hypocrisy is a bad thing, but surely it's a matter of the degree of it. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, we live in an age of scrutiny, and such is the level of scrutiny these days that if we go too far down the road of saying that hypocrisy is the worst vice, I mean, what are we saying? Are we saying that no politician can really campaign for things like family values unless they live the life of a monk or a nun? I mean, it's very difficult, and as a result, you end up with a kind of morally rather nihilistic culture where no one feels free to stand for anything because their past is going to be looked through with a tooth comb.
I think a number of distinctions have to be made that maybe haven't been. If we are worried about politicians who cheat on their wives or husbands, we have to know what is the worry. Is it that they just can't be trusted to do their job properly? E.g., if they can't be trusted to be honest in their family relationships, they may not be trustworthy in their political decisions. That's one thing. That's just a question of, you know, does this sort of person behave in a trustworthy way? But I suspect that the worry behind what Anne Atkins has said is something else. It's that we just should not tolerate hypocrisy. There's something awful about the hypocrisy. Which leads to another question, which is, what is wrong with hypocrisy, as you asked at the beginning? Is it the discrepancy between what is your self-presentation and the reality? Or is it just that the awful reality is made all the more obvious by the failure to conform with the self-presentation? You know, you could say for the hypocrite, at least he does at least preach something a bit better in the way he practices. He's not just like somebody who both preaches awful things and practices them. And then again, is it the question of we don't like his self-righteousness? Well, of course, the righteous can be self-righteous, just as the wrongous can be self-righteous. So I just think a number of different questions need to be disentangled.
I wanted to go back to what Anne said about cruelty and hypocrisy. And it seems to me that the cruelty and our hate for hypocrisy is fundamentally related, because is it better to preach evil and do evil than preach good and do evil?
Okay, at some point earlier on, we were talking about how about the question with parents and hypocrisy at home. And I think the question of hypocrisy with children at home is completely separate to that in politics or health or anywhere else where adults are concerned. Children do not understand the boundaries of do not lie or don't do this or don't do that, because they simply aren't old enough to know where their limitations are. So the intent of the parent in that instance is that they will someday understand when they can tell a white lie or something like that. That's something that people understand as they mature. This is completely separate to anything that happens in politics. I personally can't understand how we can draw a similarity between parenting children and that kind of thing, that kind of hypocrisy at home, than with politics. Because in politics, we have seen, like I've been at different sessions around today, the question of a better leadership when leaders today should be more authentic. In the sense of a good leader today is one who can really represent our values as their true self. As in whether what they represent on the media, what they represent in their private lives is exactly the same. That is the authenticity that we need to see from our leaders, which would lead to less hypocrisy.
Anyone want to respond? Joe?
Yeah, what I'm finding very interesting about what's coming out of those several questions is this sort of grey area. And I think, yes, we've got to embrace this grey area and say it is very real. Nobody is perfect. Nobody is going to live up to his ideal. And a lot of this is the judgment of, where you draw the line. I mean, going back to the example of a vicar who's beating his wife, I think we would all say he probably should resign. A vicar who loses his temper with the children and shouts at them, he's doing wrong, yes, but maybe that is not, I think it's probably not a resigning issue. And I think a lot of this, we've just got to be honest and say we don't know when we're all going to have slightly different nuances on it. I mean, the example that was given by the lady here about the school, I think is a very interesting one. I have a friend who is not a Christian who was working in a Roman Catholic school and living with her boyfriend. And the school, she was very angry about the situation because the school would not allow her to talk about her private life to the pupils. But I could see that also from the school's point of view because, at least they were employing somebody who had different values, but they had the values they had to preach to the children. So again, I think that's a really difficult area, really difficult to get it right. And the question about, is it better to preach evil and do evil, or to preach good and do evil? Obviously, it's better to preach good and do evil, but the difficulty is that the doing evil completely very substantially undermines the preaching the good, particularly with the wonderful example of parents, because children see through everything. And if you say don't lie but you lie, they will get the message it's okay to lie. So,
yeah.
But I think we've got to be honest that there is a very big grey area here, and we are going to disagree exactly where we draw the line.
Yeah, but I agree perfectly, completely with the example from parenting. I wasn't implying when I used that example that politics and bringing up children is the same thing, but I was making a point about trust. Once you lose your trust, and whether you're a politician or a parent, you've lost it, then you're not going to enable people to believe you. You're not going to put people in a position to believe you next time you're going to tell them something, representing it as the truth, because now they can catch you out. And of course, one must make a distinction as well between trivial matters like wearing a jumper, what color jumper you wear, and making political decisions which are going to have a tremendous effect on the lives of people. And so I agree that the first example would be a trivial example of of a journalist talking about something which maybe could create some kind of interest among those who are interested in that kind of thing. But then reporting facts about whether one should go to war or not, that's a much more serious situation. And there's this idea, in a democracy we're always saying everybody has a right, freedom of expression, think what you like. Yes, but we seem to forget that the first thing we should be saying in a democratic society is that we ought to have a respect for the truth. That is, we ought to respect facts. And now, of course, I know that people would say there's always facts and interpretations of facts, but I was just asking a question, how far can you take that distinction?
Okay, right.
Yeah, I think we just have, hypocrisy is difficult. It's difficult in the personal realm, and it's difficult in the public realm, and in the interface between them. And each of these instances needs to be carefully examined, actually. It's very difficult to make great generalizations about them. I think just to go back to somebody asked about realpolitik. Interesting, there isn't an English word for it. Realpolitik, whether the difference between realpolitik and bad faith. Realpolitik to me is not bad faith. It's about the management of the real world of politics. And what is bad faith is to pretend that you can't deal with that without a certain amount of dissimulation. It seems to me an inevitable feature of that. And that's what I mean about hypocrisy. It's passing off tough decisions as if they were foregone conclusions, or the opposite, passing off foregone political decisions as if they required a great deal of anguishing, like Blair and Bush going to war in Iraq. The idea that to pray overnight everyone is a complete logical continuation of their previous politics. That's hypocrisy about hypocrisy, which is corrupting of public life. And I think these are the sort of distinctions that we need to examine very carefully in relation to particular situations. You can't say generally I'm against hypocrisy either in personal life or public life, because it's there in both spheres. It's unfortunately inescapable.
Okay, Ruth, then I'll come back up.
Just small points, really. I do think we should allow of Blair that he genuinely, deeply believed in the rightness of what he was doing, and that he was, in a way, really idealistic about it. And I'm not a Blair enthusiast, but he wasn't being hypocritical in the sense of pretending he was doing something good when he knew he was doing something bad. It was the means to an end. And that was mostly Alistair Campbell, by the way, who did the worst of that. And Alistair Campbell, who's at the moment blazing round all the broadcasting studios, denouncing the wickedness of various aspects of the press. Dear God. Nerve. Just one thing, somebody mentioned social media, and we haven't really touched on that, and it's an interesting one, because I think the young who are using social media particularly are less hypocritical than the middle-aged or older, in the sense that they do let it all hang out in every conceivable sense on social media. And I think because I've talked to some of them about this, what are you going to do when in 15 years somebody sees the picture of you with your, etc. And they say nobody will care by then because everybody will have done it. And maybe they're right, and maybe there will be less opportunity for the media to reveal embarrassing things. I mean, I've forgotten which newspaper is going after Gloria, what's her name's topless photographs when she was 15. Well, that's just preposterous that anybody should take seriously what anyone did when they were 15. Like Cameron being in the Bullingdon Club when he was 18. He was an idiot, he was 18.
And Ruth, just to pick up on this, the going to war thing, yes, he believed in the rightness of what he was doing, but he used the wrong means to do it. And this comes back to the self-righteousness. That was based on a lie. That is a very, very shocking thing, I believe. And, however right he thought he was, does thinking you're right give you the right to lie? No, I don't think it does.
Okay, I'm going to take one or two more from the audience if we can.
There's a distinction if we visualize a three-circle Venn diagram between the lies people tell, the hypocrisies they perpetrate, and for any given role, what is required of an incumbent in that role. And I think clearly we've heard quite a lot about, for instance, the hypocrisy of politicians. I think we've also heard the point about the importance of truth. And I think in that Venn diagram, I would think there's a category for the lies politicians tell that are not a necessary part of the hypocrisy of being a politician. And clearly, if you go to war on a false prospectus, that would seem to be in that category. I think on the point about medicine and politicians, I would draw a further distinction. I think, as far as medicine is concerned, a certain degree of hypocrisy would appear to be a requirement of the role, because failing that hypocrisy, you're cruel. In the case of politicians, it's less clear to me that hypocrisy is a requirement of the role. It may be a requirement of achieving office, but it may not be a requirement of the role once you're in the role. So I think there's a more ambiguous case there. But clearly, I think, and we sometimes conflate the two things, and I think there is a distinction between politicians lying and politicians being hypocritical.
One thing that hasn't really been touched upon is the idea of standards. Standard being an objective thing that, say you're with your children and you say, these are our standards. I'm not perfect and I'm not always going to stand up to them the way I think I should. And just being transparent about that. And the kids are going to say, well, yeah, mom and dad do these things, but we still know they're wrong because, they kind of invested in these standards with us. The same thing goes with politicians. They can make mistakes, but at the same time, they have to be able to say, I've fallen short of these standards, and I've done so to such a degree. I have to be honest with myself and to you as my constituents that I need to step down.
Hi, I would just like to protest the good and evil discourse that's been unfolding here, especially when it comes to marital politics. I don't know why is it evil not to be monogamist, and I would like to protest that. And I would just like to say that, for example, the examples that were given for example, Charles and Diane and them being unfaithful, maybe they had a secret private agreement not to be because they knew that their marriage is not functioning. We can't know about it, and maybe they were not ready to, they had to conform to the expectations of the majority of the society. And I don't think that this is any bit hypocritical. I mean,
is there a difference between an ideal that a politician might espouse, but then also one that they actively push? So, my example is Chris Huhne, who pushed heavily CCTV traffic cameras for speeding, and then had 12 points, or should have had 15 or 18, or however many he should have had. There's a man who pushes a particular policy of speed cameras to reduce people speeding and whatnot, and then drives like a maniac. So, you know, are those two things, is that not worse than somebody who says, oh yes, you should have good family values and whatever? Is that not worse?
I think that's a very interesting question that you've asked. Why is it wrong not to be monogamous? I mean, since we're talking of hypocrisy, I suppose one could then posit the hypothesis that if you, if you say to your electorate, my partner and I have an open marriage and we both have affairs and we don't have any issue with that, then you're not being hypocritical, and that is one option. You might then not get elected because the British public is actually quite old-fashioned on this. Is it old-fashioned? I don't know. That many people do think adultery matters because, again, it actually, funnily enough, comes back to the word that Ruth used first off, of cruelty. I mean, it doesn't always cause cruelty, but in many instances it does. And in many instances, the people who suffer most are the most innocent, who are not the ones committing adultery, and in particular the children. So that's why the electorate cares about it. Now, okay, you can say you don't espouse those values, and that's a brave thing to do, and maybe that is, laudable. But you've got to be elected by people who have their own values, and you may have to respect those values. I mean, just briefly on the Charles Diana thing, I mean, which of us knows, but I did not get the impression that she wanted to be cheated on, I have to say. And I don't think many people do want to be cheated on, and very few children want their parents cheating on them, actually.
Okay, thank you. Mike?
I think the cruelty is an interesting problem, I think it's important to recognise what a historically specific kind of conception it is. The Eighth Amendment to the American Constitution forbids cruel and unusual treatment. It's quite interesting in retrospect that didn't mean people being hung, drawn and quartered, which was done quite regularly in the early American states. It meant what was considered unjust forms of taxation. These ideas vary through time, nor did it forbid torture, for that matter, which other commentators forbid on pragmatic grounds, some on grounds of principle. But I do think that I would put a greater priority on cruelty as a vice than I would on hypocrisy, for the reasons that I've tried to indicate, that hypocrisy has some value, and it is an inevitable and inescapable feature, it seems to me, of life. Cruelty has no redeeming features. It condemns people to a life of fear, destroys freedom, and in that respect, it's something that should be totally abjured. The relationship between the two is that cruelty is sometimes, no doubt, made easier by hypocrisy, and hypocrisy does cause cruelty, but it's of the two of them the greater evil.
Okay, thank you. Joe?
I don't know whether one ought to make this huge distinction between hypocrisy and lying, for example. Incidentally, okay, they're not exactly the same thing, but they're related, aren't they? I mean, it's always a question of saying something which you believe to be false and presenting it as if it were true. knowing that it's false. And hypocrisy, in a sense, also does that, doesn't it? You behave in a way in which you try to give the impression that things are not exactly as they are, but when you know they are not like that, but you behave in a way in which you try to make people behave they are like that. So there is definitely a relation between those two things. We do feel, I think, that we're being cheated when people are lying to us or when they're being hypocritical. There's a question of somebody who's bought a painting, he was told that it was an original painting, and then he finds out that is a fake. You see, that this feeling of being cheated, which is also interesting, I think, in the case of children who discover that what their parents have been telling them, they haven't been living up to those standards themselves. So I think they have a right to turn around and say, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, but you told me we shouldn't cheat, but you're cheating. Okay, and I think that this question about the private and the public, right? In a society, as I was saying, where at least theoretically marriage is supposed to be relations between people are supposed to be monogamous, then the fact that you've cheated on your wife and then that you felt that you had to hide it and not reveal it, and when it's revealed, then you feel that you have to defend yourself by saying, it didn't happen. I mean, that does show that there's something there of an incongruence or an inconsistency in people who behave in that way. Thank you.
Thanks. Finally, Ruth.
Just to pick up on the point about Chris Huhne, yes, that was hypocritical, what was happening with the speeding. But I think what was most hypocritical about him was the election leaflet with the picture of him and his family, which he produced at a time when he was having an affair with his aide. And I don't think there's any circumstances in which that isn't atrocious behaviour. And then the cruelty with which he treated his wife when he elected to go with his mistress. The second point, the Charles and Di one, well, I would just say that Charles wouldn't have married Di if he wasn't under enormous pressure to do the right thing by the country and find a well-bred virgin. And they found a 19-year-old since there were so few virgins about. And that was unfair to everybody.
But I think he imagined that. I mean, I think the British public wouldn't have had any problem with his marrying.
But that was the thinking in Buckingham Palace. It wasn't him.
No, but he could have been a man about it.
Well, but I think it's a separate argument. The third one, I thought the gentleman who talked about standards there was dead right, actually. You know, for anybody, you've got to say, I will do my best, these are my standards, but I probably won't live up to them, and I haven't always, and I'm sorry, and if you find I've failed you, sorry. But the last thing I want to throw at you is Boris Johnson. For heaven's sake, everybody loves Boris. He's a hypocrite, he's a liar, but he's less of a hypocrite than most politicians because most of the time he says, okay, hands up, did it, and nobody minds. But that is because he has an extraordinary charm. I mean, Boris does lie, but he lies in the manner of a terribly attractive 6-year-old schoolboy. And we all forgive him. And he's the most popular politician in the country. And you explain that one, I can't, except the jokes are great. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ruth, and thanks to the whole panel.